The next presentation will be on planning for EVs in Kentucky. Presenters are Justin Harrod. Justin began his career with the Kentucky Transportation Cabinet in 2010. He currently works for the modal branch in the Division of Planning. His primary responsibilities center on development and implementation of the Kentucky Electric Vehicle Infrastructure Deployment Plan, air quality, and assisting highway design with the value engineering program. Justin is a 2009 graduate of Murray State University, a native of Frankfort, Kentucky, and resides here with his wife, Shelley, and their 3 children. Also presenting is Rob Frazier. Rob is HDR's transportation planning lead in Kentucky. He is also one of HDR's national leaders in the fields of emerging technologies, safety, and performance-based practical design. He has been practicing transportation planning and engineering for over 30 years. Guys.
Thank you. Just and I are very pleased to be here to talk to you about EV planning in Kentucky. And given time, we're going to jump right in. I am going to quickly go over what we're going to run through. We're going to give a quick overview of the EV technology, kind of the basics, and we're going to talk about barriers to EVs in Kentucky and what we've heard and what's happening there, and then the National Electric Vehicle Infrastructure Program, which is where federal money is flowing into the states to address some of those barriers. And then we're going to talk about EV planning in Kentucky, kind of the headline of today, and then where we are headed with implementation and a request for information. So I'm going to talk first about just some basics with electric vehicles. There are 3 basic types of electric vehicles. We're going to be focusing on the one on the far left, which is battery electric vehicles. It's battery powered only, and those have a range of around 150 to as much as 400 miles on one charge. And that's really the focus of everything we're going to be talking about today. But we do want to acknowledge there are other types of electric vehicles. There are the plug-in hybrids, which are powered by both gasoline and a battery, but the battery only covers 20 to 40 miles as local driving. And then there are the hybrid electric vehicles, which use regenerative braking and the engine itself to generate electricity. So they don't plug in at all. So again, we're focused on the far left. So just want to make sure we're on the same page with that. The second thing I want to talk about is charging. There are 3 basic types of chargers. The far left, level 1 is what comes with your new EV. It just plugs into a standard outlet and is really kind of for emergency charging. The middle one is the standard charging that most people will use for 80 to 90% of their charging at home, at work, when they're shopping, where you plug it into something that's essentially equivalent to a dryer outlet, so 220, 240. And it takes about 10 hours to charge a car, so overnight will work very well. But what we're mainly going to be talking about today is the level 3. It's a direct current fast charging, DCFC. And that is really what we're focused on, and that is designed for helping people be able to make long distance trips. So you go a long distance, you want to be able to keep going and get back from wherever you've gone. And all right, so we asked folks in Kentucky, what are the barriers to electric vehicles here in Kentucky? A lot of things came up, a lot of different barriers. You see many of them up there: cost, availability, range, infrastructure. And what we are talking about today is actually addressing a lot of those barriers, not all of them, but a lot of them, and addressing issues related to that infrastructure side and the ability to charge when you need it, when you are out on the road. So there are a lot of things that are being addressed in this program. And so the program itself comes out of the IIJA, the Infrastructure and Investment and Jobs Act, also known as the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law. And so that led to the National Electric Vehicle Infrastructure Program, NEVI. And so out of that federal legislation, late last year, came NEVI. And NEVI has 2 components, 2 parts to it. On the left is the formula funding. Every state gets formula funds. And then on the right is a competitive grant program that the guidance is not out yet on, and Justin will talk more about that in a little bit. But that is coming. But on the left is here now, and we'll be talking about, again, focusing our attention mostly on that today. All right, so the goal of that NEVI program is, I'm just going to read this: convenient, reliable, affordable, and equitable national EV charging network. That is the goal of the program. It's stated throughout the guidance multiple times that that is the goal. And so it's focused on, and they make this very clear in the federal guidance, on interstates and long distance travel. How do we allow people to make those long distance trips? And the funding that Kentucky is going to receive is $69.5 million over 5 years. About $25 million in the first 2 years. And the total, when you use include 20% match at the bottom of the slide, is up to $87 million. That match, it's 20% match to get that federal money, and it can come from private sources, public sources, any non-federal source to fill out that funding amount. All right, so the use of the funds, it is for, at the outset, it is for alternative fuel corridors and then other locations. So that's that interstate focus, long distance travel. And we'll talk a little bit more about what alternative fuel corridors are in Kentucky. And the charging station requirements are, these stations must be located on those corridors every 50 miles and no more than a mile off of the corridor. There's other requirements. Justin will touch on some of those. I won't get bogged down on those right now. There are lots of them. And then the plan, every state has to provide a plan to secure those funds. And so we've done that, but before we talk about it, Justin's going to talk about a few other programs.
Thank you. Good morning, everybody. So while there is NEVI funding coming to the states, there are also several types of funding that will be available to mainly kind of like local communities, as the NEVI funding coming to the state is for the state DOTs. And as Rob mentioned, that competitive grant funding that's supposed to be announced later this year will be open to everyone. But some additional funding sources would include like the Volkswagen settlement funding that the Energy Cabinet, Environmental Energy Cabinet will be in charge of. And that is supposed to be coming out later this fall or early winter. The competitive grant funding, which I just mentioned. And then also there's the Tennessee Valley Authority, the Kentucky Clean Fuels Coalition, and also Evolve Kentucky, which has been, these entities have been sort of installing chargers, for the past kind of few years, and they are continuing to do so. And as EVs have picked up a little bit of steam over the past year, I'm sure they will continue to do so. So as Rob mentioned, states were required to do a deployment plan. Starting mid-February, we had until about July 1st to get this plan put together, to then go through the approval process of the chain of command and then being able to submit prior to the August 1st deadline. And so the coordination that we had to have with not just in-state agencies, but also utilities, our stakeholder groups that we had, which encompassed a lot of different stakeholders. And as we continue, we've to date had 100+ meetings reaching over 1,000 people that helped inform us of this plan that we have submitted as a draft to Federal Highways. And we are now waiting from Federal Highways to get that approval, which should be by no later than the end of this month. And so this kind of represents sort of the stakeholders that we've been involved with. And so we worked with private industry, utilities, government, nonprofit, and manufacturers. And so you can kind of see there was a lot of people that were involved and continue to be involved. Just because we've submitted our plan doesn't mean that we haven't continued not to have meetings or, answer questions or reach out as people still want to learn more about what it is that we plan to do as a state to bring EVs. So some stakeholder feedback that we gathered from our stakeholder meetings was we wanted to hear from them. You know, I know that federal highways had some requirements as to kind of how stuff needed to be spaced, but we also want to take care of the Commonwealth citizens. And so we wanted to put it sort of like in their hands as well as to inform us of our plan. And so it kind of matched up perfectly with, you know, building out chargers along the interstates, followed by chargers on the parkways, and then chargers on other state priority routes. And so, and then, you know, getting to the community chargers was the next step. And so it kind of it was kind of parallel to what we were trying to do to meet federal highways requirements. And so that was kind of nice to see that, you know, everybody was sort of on the same page. And out of, you know, we asked some site characteristics, and these were the top 3 characteristics from stakeholders, where, you know, service to long distance travelers and plugging gaps. You know, while we do have to focus somewhat on the alternative fuel corridors, we want to make sure that we're not leaving gaps in the state, that we're able to reach everybody that wants to have an electric vehicle, and they don't, as Rob pointed out, the barriers, you know, we want to try and take care of those barriers. So if they want to get an electric vehicle, they will have the infrastructure in place to do so, and they won't have to worry. And so this brings us to our Kentucky high priority EV map. You will see in sort of the light blue, the primary interstates, and these are sort of interstates that were already kind of designated as EV corridors. And then we have our the dark blue is parkways and other interstates or freeways that we then nominated to sort of, you know, kind of reach the broad section of the state. And so, but you'll also notice in orange that in order to fill some gaps, you know, we wanted to make sure not to leave out big sections of the state. And so that was our goal, is to make sure that, you know, there isn't a sizable chunk of the state that is being left out. And one thing that I would like to mention, a few months ago, the governor had a kind of his weekly press conference, and he was talking about this map, and he stated something that, you know, has kind of stayed with me, is, you know, this is a start, but it's only a start, and it will expand as we, you know, get further guidance from federal highways and being able to reach more into the community. And so that's kind of brings us to the alternative fuel corridors that you see on your screen, which encompasses all of the interstates and parkways in the state. And so on July 7th, Federal Highways approved our request to designate the parkways and additional interstates, freeways to have that. And so this kind of gets us to the phase funding of the plan. And so, you know, I'll point to, you see kind of phase 1 and 2 and 3 and 4, but, you know, phase 1 and 2, which is the interstates and the parkways and other freeways, interstates, they we're hoping and planning to do this concurrently. And so we were able to, you know, put chargers on parkways and interstates at the same time. And then that kind of leads to phase 3 and 4, where you're talking about the other priority highways and then getting to the community charging. And right now, you know, Federal Highways has mentioned that funds from the NEVI program can only be spent on the AFCs. Now, they do realize that once you achieve build out of these and get approval from the Secretary of DOT, you know, the remaining funds, you know, what can we do with those? And so future guidance is supposed to be coming out as to kind of where that additional funding, you know, if left over, can go. But that's also why I wanted to point out some of the other funding sources is, you know, while we're trying to have to focus on what Federal Highways is requiring us to do on the alternative fuel corridors, there's other funding sources that can work parallel to what we're doing to perhaps go ahead and start on phase 3 and phase 4. So while we can't get to phase 3 or 4 right now, those type of funding sources might be able to hit it right now. And that competitive grant funding, which is coming out later this year, will also be, I think, huge for our state. And so, as Rob mentioned, there's some requirements that Federal Highways had. He kind of mentioned no more than 50 miles apart, 1 mile off the corridor. We have to have at least 4 ports at 150 kilowatts per port for a total of 600 kilowatts per station. It has to be open to the general public 24/7. It can't be behind a gate. It can't, be just when a business has hours. And so it cannot be proprietary. And then the cost of these chargers, because they require so much energy, we've kind of budgeted about $1 million right now. And also the cost of like inflation and supply chain issues has also driven up that cost. And so we're kind of using $1 million mark per station in order to kind of use that as a benchmark. And then, as I mentioned, considerable lead times. We've talked to the utilities, and they're talking about, the, transformers are, on back order, some, between like 6 months, maybe a little bit longer, up to a year. I think we've heard from a few of the utilities. And so there's just a lot of unknowns at the time as well, as to, how it plays into getting these deployed. And I'll turn back.
Yeah, so I'm going to talk, continuing on with the plan, talk about what do we need, what's the demand, where can it go, where are there suitable locations, and then where is it most needed? And those last two are very different questions. We'll get into that in a minute, but we'll start with the demand. So we've looked at sales forecasts for electric vehicles in Kentucky, and as we looked at how we think things are likely to unfold in Kentucky, we think that by the end of the decade will be around 20%, 1 out of 5 vehicles sold being an electric vehicle. And then around a third by the 2035 timeframe, and then by 2045 over half. Now it takes around 20 years for a vehicle fleet to turn over completely, as vehicles are being bought today and they're going to be on the road for quite some time. So what you will see out on the road is going to lag behind this a fair bit, but it will continue to change. And this shows that the change is expected to continue, and it already has been growing just in the last 2 years. All right, so long distance trips, another key part of demand. Where are people making long distance trips? 150 miles, 250 miles. And you can see that the interstates, parkways carry quite a number of long distance trips, and we want to make sure that we're able to serve those trips. So that fed into what I'm now showing you is the demand for charging. So we were able to use that information to predict where we think there will be a demand for these stations that Justin was just talking about. These the 4-port and kind of powerful stations every 50 miles. And you can see that the red more than 2, so more than what the federal guidance has said will be needed, where you see the red and the orange, it's 2 or more on those. And then the green, it's 1 or not quite 1. And but that's just a snapshot, a preliminary snapshot for 2030. That will continue to change, and the green will turn orange, the orange will turn red, and the demand will continue to grow. But we were able to look at that to give us kind of a framework to work within. All right, so where can the stations go? This suitability prioritization, where can they go? Where do we need to fill those gaps? And I'll just draw your attention to the bottom bullets there on the slide, that the plan does not identify specific site locations. This is a high-level plan to set a framework. That was not our intent to get to the site level. And so we looked at interchange areas. We looked at various areas as we did our work, and that we very much need the private sector and expect the private sector to be very involved in in leading to kind of the actual site locations, those optimal site locations. And Justin's going to talk more about that in just a moment. So suitability prioritization, we had a set of criteria that we looked at for both of them. On the suitability side, just draw your attention to the top three. So distance to existing stations that are already compliant with the federal guidance. We don't want to build them too close to those. We want to be far, fairly far away from those. We want to look at that long distance travel map, and we want to know where the power is available, reliable, available power to power these stations. So on the suitability side, those were some key things. You can read the others. On the prioritization side, it's all the same factors for suitability were considered, but weighted somewhat differently. But there's additional things that we need to take into consideration. That is making sure that we cover the entire state, as Justin mentioned. So the distance to stations, still very important, but Justice 40 designations and rural designations were very important considerations. So underserved communities, rural communities, we need to fill the gaps. We need to make sure that everyone has access to charging as they're traveling, both through the state and within the state, and serving everyone. So this is an example for one of those criteria, the disadvantaged community map, Justice 40. This information was actually provided to us by the federal government for this project specifically. The Department of Energy and Department of Transportation joined up, and the purple areas there show you where the disadvantaged communities are within Kentucky per the federal direction. And you can see how our alternative fuel corridors line up with those. And so we're able to use that information in our look at the different interchanges along those corridors, looking at the criteria. So that leads to the maps that come from that. So this is the suitability map. And again, I'll say study did not look at specific sites. These are not specific sites. These are interchange areas, and just giving a sense of, from a planning perspective, looking at our criteria, are these locations suitable for one of these NEVI charging stations? So we've got a suitability map that shows where the stations could go reasonably, and you can see all the corridors are covered. But you can also see that we don't want to be too close to the existing yellow dots where we already have a station along particular corridors. And then the prioritization map is the second side of this, is where do we, as the Transportation Cabinet, where do we want to invest funds to make sure that we build this out in a way that is beneficial for everyone in Kentucky? So it's not, so it's considering some of the suitability criteria, but this is really where do we need to help the market? Because as Justin said, this is kind of, we're kicking things off. This is to get things started. And how do we fill gaps and get things started and invest the money maybe where the market is less inclined to invest funds, so we can make sure that everyone is served. So that's this prioritization map. And again, not specific sites, but it gives a sense, and there's locations across every one of the AFC corridors. All right, so with that, I will turn it back to Justin.
All right, so now that we got our plan to federal highways back at the end of July, we took like a very short, like 2-day rest, and then started working on looking towards, what is the next step? How is this going to be implemented in the state, deployment in the state? So then we quickly started to gather, what type of contracting method are we going to use? And so, as Rob mentioned, this is, and I mentioned earlier, the NEVI funding is to jumpstart the industry. And, the role of the private entities is going to be crucial in helping us to determine sort of, where these sites need to go. And I will mention Kentucky, like 99.9% of other states do not want to own, operate, or maintain these. Another reason why the private sector will be a huge critical component of this, because Kentucky just wants to be able to, follow the federal highway requirements, and then just sort of step out of the way and let EV, charge forward, pun intended, on its way. So As I mentioned, KYTC started a process, a request for information. We got that finalized and put that out to everybody on August 24th. And that is to help get responses, feedback. We did it very broadly. We sent it to a lot of people, potential EV industry partners. And from that, we're hoping that their comments and their feedback will help us be able to prepare a request for proposals and guide us on what is the best contracting method. We're having internal discussions right now as to, what looks good right now. And then once we get that feedback, does it still kind of align with what we're thinking, or, do we need to kind of go this route? And then we begin station deployment. And so this kind of brings us to like what our hope is our timeline and what we're planning our timeline to be. There are some things that I'll get to in a second that could alter that. But as you'll see right now, September 8th, we are waiting on Federal Highways to approve the plan. We're having ongoing meetings and with stakeholders. I continue to meet with like MPOs, ads, local governments, and, just trying to make sure to get the word out that they know, there's funding that's coming, how can we help? I want to be able to, and, like other people want to be able to help as much as we can to get people prepared for this funding. And so they are ready for their grant applications. And so we are, finalize it. Our RFI is out. The deadline for it is September 30th. And then once that comes in, that will start the next phase, which will take us into like the, late winter, early spring, of getting our RFP out. And then we plan to start moving forward with implementation / deployment of these chargers in that early spring, late winter timeframe. And as I mentioned, there are some instances that might impact our schedule. There's some unknowns. We're still waiting on a final rule from the Federal Highways on an NPRM, a notice to proceed rulemaking that just closed back on August 22nd. And so that's something, if stuff changes, we'll have to adapt. There's also the supply chain issues that I mentioned earlier, where it's taken a little bit longer to get stuff in. And then also the Buy America requirement. Just last week, there was an EV charging Buy America request for comment that came out that kind of lays out like a specific timeline of how it might affect EVs. And so, that comment period closes on September 30th. And so what comes from that might also impact, our schedule. And so there's just a few unknowns and stuff that we're still waiting to be finalized that could impact our schedule. But this is what we're planning on as of now. And so this kind of just brings us back around to the RFI that I mentioned, where we're trying to, get planning, deployment, operation, and maintenance. We have a lot of questions in there. We want to make sure that it was robust enough that we are going to be able to get the feedback that we want, since we are hoping that the responses will help us inform our request for proposals. And it's available online at the website or the link that you see on your screen. But if you go to the KYTC planning homepage at the cabinet's website, you will see like a banner that's of pictures that kind of scroll through, and EVs in there. I think it's the third or fourth one, but there's also to the side, you can just click electric vehicles, and that will take you to a web page that has our draft plan and our RFI. And there's also some resources up there for local governments, utilities, and MPOs, ads, and highway districts. And so just to sort of recap, this NEVI funding that's coming to the state, we're wanting to, with the formula funds, we're going to be completing our RFI process, issuing an RFP, award a contract, and begin development. And, hopefully everything is just streamless and everything goes according to plan. And then also with the NEVI competitive grant funds, That guidance is expected later this year. And also what's expected later this year is some guidance from Federal Highways on how to perhaps handle medium duty and heavy duty vehicles, AKA freight. Right now, it's kind of focused more on the light duty passenger vehicles, but we have had discussions with some of our stakeholders that kind of represent the freight industry on, what are they thinking? How can we start to prepare to get ready? And so, we're already kind of starting to have conversations as we look towards, what Federal Highways might bring forth regarding that. And so, I'll just reiterate that this competitive grant funding will be available to anybody in the country, and it will be, for level 2s, for, probably DCFC fast chargers as well. And so, that's another reason why we want to continue our stakeholder engagement and have meetings with local governments, MPOs, ads, or highway districts in order to give you the answers that you need as you get questions from the public, because you might get them first before they get funneled up to myself or someone else at the central office. And so, we just want to make sure that we are preparing and getting ready to help you all as well for any questions that might come out. And if there are questions, or if you think of something after this, evplan@ky.gov has been set up, and this is an email address that I myself monitor. And I will say that I try to get back within a few business days. So please send any questions or comments that you think of, perhaps after this presentation, or if you're not, I'll be around if you need to talk to me, or if you can't. I would say just send it to this and I will reply to you. And then, as I mentioned, the planning website is at the link below. And I'm not sure how we're doing on time. All right, time. Okay. I guess, do we want to ask questions or? Okay, and we have a couple minutes for questions. And I'm sorry, I can't. Yep. Yes, so with the interstates and parkways, as I mentioned, we're kind of budgeting about like $1 million per station as of right now. I believe like it was going to be somewhere in the about $31 million range to have the interstates and parkways are built out. And then, as we move forward, kind of what do we do, as we start looking towards the other priority state highway routes and community charging, and waiting for that federal guidance as to kind of how are we able to spend like, other funding that's available from that 69.5 million. Yes. So right now, as that $1 million when we did it, yes. If stuff has increased since our development of the plan, we kind of put a range of like 800 to 1.2 million, but we kind of just went with the average of $1 million. But yes, with talking with the utilities, we were able to get like a 3-phase power map of the state of Kentucky. And so, that kind of went with the suitability that Rob was talking about. And so if the station is already in place, then that kind of drops down to that 800,000 per station if an upgrading of a substation or transformers are not needed. But right now, everything is focused in there, in that $1 million. I can't see if there's anybody else in the back. Anybody else? All righty. Well, if you have questions, I know we're getting ready to probably take a break. I'll be around. Just please feel free to come up to me. Thank you.
That's a strong presentation. I wish I'd known that a month ago when I was in Washington. I could have kind of relayed that to other states where we were as far as status on deployment of EVs. Let's take a break right now. We'll be back at 9:45.